if you had government programs which promoted the nuclear family or the cross-generational family at a propaganda level, national level, like we would do with patriotism during a war, things like that, do you think that we would have more or less as it came to traditional family units, more or less?
More or less family units if we put out propaganda? Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it depends on how effective the propaganda is, but sure. I mean, we probably would have more traditional family units.
Right. So then if you do a promotion for alternative family units, that would erode that, right?
For alternative, you mean?
Well, necessarily, if it's going to increase the amount of traditional family units, if there's national propaganda to move towards that.
I didn't say necessarily. I said likely, but.
Okay, but even likely, then it would be likely the other way around.
Sure, it would be likely the other way around, that if we put out propaganda for something, that people would latch onto it, as people do.
Sure. And do you agree with me that alternative family units is the propaganda which is now produced mostly out of leftist institutions, out of feminist institutions, and out of feminist propositions to government?
Well, remember, we're talking about my version of feminism, not
your version. Your version does that, right?
Have I given you much of, like, I don't think I've told you much about my version of feminism.
Yeah, I think you have. That's your movement. So you just got done saying that you would propagate, or you would support the government itself pushing propaganda for alternative family units, right?
Wait, that's not, no, I didn't say that. I mean, wouldn't? We can watch this back, but what do you mean by that?
Like at the national level, the government doing things like putting LGBTQ flags all over the White House, maybe putting the White House in an LGBTQ flag, perhaps having NGOs, non-government organizations, which are left-wing think tanks, working hand-in-hand with government to push alternative family units, which are staunchly feminist and psychological institutions, things like that. Okay,
so, I mean, we could bring up psychology, but I'm not sure what that had to do with that. But look, so we can say, these are fine, these things are maybe working towards normalizing those types of family units. Mm-hmm. Calling them propaganda seems like a loaded way to say that. And that's fine. If you want to use loaded terms like that, you can. That's
we can unload it. I agree with you. Propaganda has a negative connotation. I just don't know a better way to say it that people understand.
So you think that the normalization or the attempt to, normalize something is necessarily propaganda, or you think that there's a difference there?
No, I just said, I think propaganda has a negative connotation, definitionally a negative connotation. But when I say the word propaganda, I think most people understand what I mean by that word, meaning there's a national campaign towards X.
A national okay. I mean, if all you're saying by a national campaign towards X is that people want people to be accepted as being gay, or people want to be seen as normal for having a gay family where they have, two parents of the same sex and children that live in that household. If that's what you mean, then sure, I'm fine with the United States doing things like putting flags on their building, but not for that purpose. The reason that I'm fine with that, something like putting a pride flag up during Pride Month, is because that's a representation of civil rights. Actually, I spoke, by the way, a little plug for my YouTube channel. I spoke at the Florida Senate about a month ago about this. It's an infringement on constitutional rights to not allow government entities to do that. Historically, the Supreme Court has ruled that way, by the way. But that is a promotion of the civil rights of those people, not a promotion of their lifestyle. Now, while it might also
wait, hang on, back up for me real quick. Did you just say that it's unconstitutional to govern for states to govern what now? Flags? Back that up. I just want to make sure I get this right.
Right. Yeah. It's so in the instances, and this is just a descriptor of historically how it's been. The Supreme Court has ruled it unconstitutional to regulate the types of speech that government entities can employ.
Government entities being.
Do you know what a government entity is?
I'm just asking you so that I understand.
I'm just curious. I just didn't know if you genuinely didn't know.
You do realize that you could have proprietary definitions of things that may not. I
think it would be charitable to assume that we're kind of using similar terms. Well, but that's fine.
Well,
I think a government entity.
Do you mean state government? Do you mean federal government? Do you mean local government?
Historically, both. The Supreme Court.
Right. So when we say government entities, I'm just trying to untangle it. That's it.
Sure. I mean, okay. Sure. Yeah. Government entities historically, both on the federal level and the state level.
Okay. So like the Confederate flag,
Historically, the Supreme Court has ruled it unconstitutional for that to be infringed upon.
Okay.
Now, the issue there can be a different argument against maybe why we shouldn't allow them to do it. Maybe it's not because it's unconstitutional, but maybe there's some other reason why we should infringe on their free speech.
Do you think we should?
On
The Confederate flag?
that would be a conversation about, what's the usefulness, what kind
No,
of
it'd be a
violence.
conversation about whether or not you're consistent in your view that because states can do this, they should be able to do this, or they should do this.
Okay, that's not true. Look,
That
what I
is
was
true.
saying, what I was saying was that take the instance of, putting up can I say the word swastika?
I would just say Swazi.
Swazi, yeah. I put up a nice 1942 flag up, on the state building or something like that. And that causes some riot or that causes some violence or something like that. There might be an argument there to say, well, because it's had this specific negative outcome, then we should restrict them from doing that. However, that's not the case with the symbolization of, Pride Month, the gay flags that are put up on buildings. The intention there is to represent the civil rights of those people. That would be like saying you can't put up American flags.
This is a civil rights issue on either end.
Do you think that the Civil War was a civil rights issue?
No, it's a civil rights issue on either end for the flag itself. So you can't say, so if you say, well, this is negative, right, or this is positive, just because one is negative doesn't mean it's not the same civil rights issue that you're pointing at here. So if you're pointing at states historically can't say anything, or government entities can't say anything about what types of flags are put up on is it state property? Is that what you're referencing?
Right. So
Yeah.
Government buildings.
Yeah, government buildings. Then it would
State-funded
still be a
buildings.
civil rights issue if you're saying that they shouldn't put up the Confederate flag. That would still be a civil rights problem.
When I asked you, do you think that the Civil War was a civil rights issue, do you think that the Confederate flag represents the civil rights of African Americans?
No.
Okay, right. So that's the symmetry breaker here. And then there's also the
Well, what do you think a civil right is?
do you think that the
Don't ask me a question before you answer my question. What do you
No.
think a civil right is?
Look, a civil right is, something, it's actually, I think, pretty vague in our legal language. But
Yeah,
a
so
civil right is something like a human right that
yeah.
most people would call
So
a
like
human
you
right.
have a right to put that flag up. Okay,
No, no,
great.
no.
I have a right to put that flag up too?
Okay, see, that's where the confusion is. So I'm talking about when I say, government entities have the right to put up like pride flags. The pride flag is the symbol of the civil rights of gay people to get married, own property, not be, have their house raided while they're having sex or something like that.
Well, okay. That's an assertion. So let's start with this. So you just making the claim like it is true that this flag represents this. That's great. It represents that to this group of people. I would make the same argument with the Confederate flag. Same exact argument. That's great that it represents a negative thing towards this group of people, but it represents a positive thing towards this group of people. It would be the same thing with the LGBTQ flag. It'd be the same argument both ways.
No, look, the problem here is that the condition that I gave for, it being fine for them to use this form of free speech is the fact that it represents the civil right of that group of people. But the Confederate flag doesn't represent the civil rights of who?
It would represent the civil rights of any people who wanted to see consistency so that they could have their flag up if they so chose. That would still be a civil right.
That isn't, maybe there's some vagueness on the civil rights thing, but I don't think that you think that, putting a flag up wherever you want on whatever property you want is a civil right. You don't believe that, right?
I think that if you were going to be consistent with your view, you would need to believe that.
That's not, okay, this isn't answering my question. You don't think that it is a civil right to display
I think it's a civil right if you put up a gay flag
I'm not sure
on
why you
government
interrupted me.
buildings. Well, I'm trying to answer the question because you said I wasn't answering it. If you put it up on
I
a
have to
government,
re-ask it for you to
if you
answer
put
it.
it up on a government, you didn't ask me a question.
I was in the middle of asking you the question.
You
and
said I'm not
clarifying.
getting the answer, so I was just giving you the answer.
So look, the question was, do you think that it's a civil right to see your flag equally displayed? Because that was what you started to say.
No, I think that it would be equally consistent to say if you can have an LGBTQ flag flying on some state building and that's constitutional, then you'd have to say the same thing about a Confederate flag.
That the argument was from the fact that that flag represented the civil rights of that
I mean,
group.
that's nice. What I'm telling you is that that's an assertion. like what demonstrate the assertion.
That's an assertion based off of the Supreme Court historically ruling it that way. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not making I can make a moral claim, and we can talk about like why people shouldn't, because I think, there might be like violence ensued by one versus the other, et cetera. But
okay, so why should you be able to have the gay flag up but not the Confederate flag?
Because I think that one represents the civil rights of a group, whereas the other one doesn't. One is more likely to incite violence. I don't think that the pride flag being up is more likely to incite violence.
Do you think heritage is part of civil rights?
I think that I think heritage is part of civil rights?
Yeah. When you're talking about the historical use of the LGBTQ flag, for instance, this is going to have some type of like historical meaning to the people in which that flag represents, right?
Right.
Okay, isn't the Confederate flag going to have the exact same thing? It's going to have some kind of historical meaning when it comes to family lineage for people who live in the South, for people who, they had ancestors who fought in this war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be part of their heritage and history. So don't you think that would have specific meaning to them as well?
Right, but there might, like I said, be overriding considerations. Like if hanging that flag caused violence or something like that. Obviously, you would say, like, okay, if we started hanging up Confederate flags and then more violence ensued against, like, African Americans, you would say we probably shouldn't hang it, right?
So then, by that metric, are you saying that if LGBTQ flags incited violence in people who were not LGBTQ, we should not hang LGBTQ flags?
Incited violence because of the flag itself? Like, if it would have to be a large amount.
That would be the same thing.
It would have to be a large amount of violence.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying then, just to make sure I got your view right, what you're actually saying here is as long as people who don't like the LGBTQ flag being up go ahead and commit a bunch of violence, they should probably take the LGBTQ flag down.
There would be multiple solutions to that, but that could be one of them. Yeah, if there was, like, let's say that was the only way to get people to stop being violent, that might be an alternative. Now, that's saying that that's, like, necessary to do to stop the violence. Now, if there's other things where we can preserve, like the protection of the displaying of it for civil rights purposes, for the representation of civil rights, and at the same time lower the violence in some other way, then yeah, we should do that alternative. Do you think that's controversial? No, but now you're just switching the position, because initially what you said was, this flag, if it's causing violence because it offends them so much that they can't help but become violent at the very look of it, or whatever it is, whatever it is that makes them respond negatively and commit violence because of this flag. All that would actually be doing is incentivizing people who are oppositional to the LGBTQ flag to commit violence, because then you would want to take that flag down, right? Well, for one, I would say, listen, I would hold the same standard. Let's go back to this, because I would hold the same standard if we had a rule where we said, okay, we can display the Confederate flag and we can display the pride flags, whatever. If there started to be violence committed on one end because of the Confederate flag, I would say, like, okay, well, before we move to, taking the flag down, we should move to stopping the violence to whatever metric we can. Now, there might be other reasons why I think, like, maybe we shouldn't display a Confederate flag. I think the Confederate flag in and of itself represents the negative part of the history that shouldn't be displayed as if we're proud of it. I think it represents slavery. You don't think it does? No, it doesn't represent slavery. It represents the heritage of people who had family members who died in the war on behalf of their beliefs. And their beliefs were? Well, the beliefs were to their state. It was being loyal to their state. Most Confederate soldiers didn't have any views on slavery, really, one way or the other. This was the higher-ups who had views like this. So the average soldier, in fact, there's one famous case of them saying, why is it that you're fighting in this war? You're so poor, you can't own a slave. And the response was, because y'all are here. So what that means is that as the North was invading the South, there was a lot of incentive for people to go and fight against it. They called it the War of Northern Aggression. And many of them had cause. They got their houses burned down, things like this, during northern marches to assist in combat in that war. And yeah, I'm sure that people are very proud of the heritage that they come from in the South, from people fighting for the core beliefs and on behalf of their families, even if you don't like the cause itself. The cause itself is still very much baked into the American history, just like for instance, I couldn't ban the LGBTQ flag because of HIV, right? I couldn't be like, well, that's a stain on our history, the fact that there was a bunch of gay sex parties and they were giving it to each other. I couldn't do that, right? I don't think that you can make a good, honest argument as to why it is that people couldn't be proud of the heritage of their family fighting in the Civil War. Look, the flag is symbol of the leaders of that war, right?
No,
the,
it's
the
not.
people, you just admitted this, the people who respond in that way, oh, well, we're fighting because you guys are here, they're there because they're there. They live there, they're trying to protect their homes and properties. That's perfectly fine. The problem is the people who were starting those wars were the ones who were using those flags. That's like saying, like, well, so-and-so wasn't a Nazi and, well, I don't know if I can say that word, fuck. So-and-so wasn't a, Schnazi in World War II. They just had families that were, Schnazi members. Or maybe they were just fighting because they thought it was like a good thing. They were fighting the other powers that invaded. You wouldn't say certainly then that, like, they should allow Schnazi flags on government buildings, right?
If the standard is that we're allowed to put up the flag of our choosing because it has some representation value that we see it as, like, let's say the people saw the Schnazi flag as being something other than I heart Hitler, I wouldn't see a problem with that. No, of course not.
Okay, so even though that it is linked to that, it is linked to support of Hitler, and the
LGBTQ flag is linked to HIV.
Okay.
That's how,
just to be
people see
clear.
it. People see it as like, oh, wow, AIDS, right? They see the rainbow flag. I think a lot of people think AIDS.
Yeah, that's fine. But there's not like gay leaders that are out there like pushing for AIDS, right?
There's not like anybody out there pushing for the Confederacy. Who's pushing for the Confederacy?
I live in the Deep South. There's people pushing for the Confederacy.
Who? Give me a single actual institution of any kind, anywhere, or any real body of people anywhere who's pushing for the Confederacy.
What do you think there have been moves historically to cede some of the states again.
That's not the Confederacy.
Because of the...